The bruise on Gabriella Everson's cheekbone had faded to a sickly yellow by the time she stood in the general store, counting out coins with trembling fingers while the shopkeeper avoided her eyes. It was April 1876 in Concordia, Kansas, and the spring sunshine streaming through the dusty windows did nothing to warm the cold dread that had become her constant companion. She could feel the weight of suspicious stares from the other customers, women who once invited her to quilting bees and church socials, now whispering behind gloved hands as though she carried some contagious disease. Her husband had seen to that with his carefully constructed lies. His poison dripped into willing ears over whiskey and cards, painting her as unstable, dangerous even, a woman whose mind had fractured under the prairie sun. Gabriella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders despite the pleasant temperature, a habit born from trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. At 24 years old, she had been married to Richard Everson for 3 years, though it felt like a lifetime. The first year had been bearable, almost pleasant, but something had shifted in him after they moved to Concordia from St. Louis. He had grown paranoid and controlling, inventing elaborate stories about her behavior to explain away his own cruelty. When neighbors heard her crying through the thin walls of their home on the edge of town, Richard told them she suffered from melancholia and fits of hysteria. When she appeared with bruises, he shook his head sadly and explained how she had fallen again, how clumsy she had become, how he worried constantly about her welfare. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, wrapped her flour and sugar in brown paper without meeting her gaze. Gabriella whispered her thanks and hurried toward the door, eager to complete her errand and return home before Richard noticed how long she had been gone. He timed her trips to town now, and any delay resulted in accusations and anger. She had learned to move quickly, speak little, and avoid drawing attention. She was so focused on her escape that she collided directly with a solid wall of muscle and denim just outside the store entrance. Strong hands caught her arms, steadying her before she could fall backward, and the parcels she had been clutching tumbled to the wooden boardwalk. "Steady there, madam," a deep voice said, warm with concern. "Are you all right?" Gabriella looked up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen, set in a tanned face beneath the brim of a well-worn cowboy hat. The man released her arms immediately, respectfully, and crouched down to gather her scattered packages. He moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own skin, his movements unhurried despite her obvious distress. "I'm fine," she said quickly, the automatic response. "I apologize. I wasn't watching where I was going." The cowboy straightened, holding her parcels, and studied her face for just a moment too long. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps understanding, that made Gabriella's breath catch. She reached for her packages, but he held them just out of reach. "I'll walk you to wherever you're headed," he said. It wasn't a question. "These look heavy." "That's not necessary. My husband wouldn't approve of—" "Your husband isn't here," the cowboy said gently. "And a gentleman doesn't let a lady carry heavy parcels when he's got 2 good arms. My mama would have my hide. Name's Zachary Brooks, madam. I work at the Double Bar Ranch just west of town." Gabriella felt panic rising in her chest. If Richard heard that she had been seen with another man, even in the innocent context of carrying groceries, there would be hell to pay. But refusing this stranger's help would cause a scene, draw more attention, and besides, there was something in his steady gaze that made her feel, just for a moment, like a human being rather than a problem to be managed. "Gabriella Everson," she heard herself say, "I live at the Yellow House on Maple Street, but truly, I can manage from here." "I'm sure you can manage a lot of things, Mrs. Everson," Zachary said, falling into step beside her. "But you don't have to manage everything alone." They walked in silence for a moment, Gabriella acutely aware of how this must look to anyone watching. Zachary seemed unconcerned with propriety or gossip, his long stride adjusted to match her shorter pace. He couldn't have been more than 27 or 28, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked with cattle and horses. Everything about him suggested capability and strength, but it was the quiet kindness in his voice that threatened to undo her carefully constructed composure. "I've heard things about you in town," Zachary said conversationally as they turned onto Maple Street. "Heard you're touched in the head, violent even, clumsy as a newborn foal." Gabriella stopped walking, her face burning with humiliation. "Then you should stay away from me, Mr. Brooks, for your own safety." Zachary stopped too, turning to face her fully. Here's the thing, Mrs. Everson. I grew up with 4 sisters, and I spent the last 10 years working ranches from Texas to Montana. I know what a woman looks like when she's being hurt, and I know what a liar's handiwork looks like when I see it. Those bruises on your face didn't come from any fall. Tears sprang to Gabriella's eyes before she could stop them. No one had acknowledged the truth in so long that hearing it spoken aloud felt like a physical shock. She wanted to deny it, to protect herself with the same lies Richard had taught her to tell, but the words wouldn't come. "Please," she whispered, "you'll only make things worse. He'll be so angry if he knows I spoke to you." "Where is your husband now?" "At the telegraph office. He's expecting a wire from his business partner in Omaha. He'll be home within the hour." Zachary glanced at the yellow house at the end of the street, then back at Gabriella. "Then I'll leave you here. But, Mrs. Everson, I want you to know something. What's happening to you isn't right, and it isn't your fault. If you ever need help, the Double Bar Ranch is 6 miles west on the main road. You can come there any time, day or night. Do you understand?" Gabriella nodded, not trusting her voice. Zachary handed her the parcels, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and she felt the warmth of that simple human contact all the way to her bones. Then he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the street with her heart pounding and something dangerous stirring in her chest. It felt like hope, and hope was the most dangerous thing of all. She hurried inside and put away the groceries, her mind racing. Richard would be home soon, and she needed to have his lunch ready, the house spotless. No reason for complaint or criticism. But as she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about Zachary Brooks and the way he had looked at her like she mattered, like she deserved better than this half-life of fear and isolation. The front door banged open just as she finished setting the table. Richard stormed in, his face already twisted with anger, and Gabriella's stomach dropped. Someone must have told him about her encounter with the cowboy. The network of gossips in Concordia worked faster than the telegraph. "Who was that man?" Richard demanded, not bothering with a greeting. He was a stocky man with thinning brown hair and small, cold eyes that seemed to catalog her every flaw. "Mrs. Henderson saw you walking with some ranch hand. Have you been carrying on behind my back?" "No, of course not. I bumped into him outside the store and dropped my packages. He was only being polite, helping me carry them." Richard crossed the room in 3 strides and grabbed her wrist, twisting it until she gasped. "You're making me look like a fool, Gabriella. People are already talking about your condition, and now you're throwing yourself at strange men in broad daylight." "I wasn't throwing myself at anyone. Richard, please, you're hurting me." He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. "You're lucky I'm a patient man. Any other husband would have you committed to an asylum for your behavior. Maybe that's where you belong, with the other lunatics." The threat hung in the air between them. Richard had made it before, and Gabriella knew he had the power to make it real. In 1876, a man's word was enough to have his wife institutionalized, especially if he had spent years laying the groundwork with stories of her instability. She would disappear into one of those nightmarish facilities, and no one would question it. They would nod sadly and agree that poor Richard Everson had done everything he could. "I'll have lunch ready in 5 minutes," she said quietly, the only safe response. Richard grunted and sat down at the table, unfolding his newspaper. Gabriella returned to the stove on shaking legs, ladling stew into a bowl she could barely hold steady. This was her life, this endless walking on eggshells, this prison built from lies and maintained by a community all too willing to believe the worst of her. But Zachary Brooks had seen through it. That realization kept circling back through her mind as she served Richard his lunch and endured his complaints about the temperature of the stew, the staleness of the bread, her general inadequacy as a wife. Someone had looked at her and seen the truth. Someone had offered help. The question was whether she was brave enough to take it. The next 2 weeks passed in their usual misery. Richard's mood grew progressively darker as some business deal fell through, and he took out his frustration on Gabriella with increasing frequency. She wore long sleeves to hide the finger-shaped bruises on her arms and learned to anticipate his rages, though there was no real pattern to them. Anything could set him off. Dinner served a minute too late, a spot on a glass. The way she looked at him or didn't look at him. She thought about Zachary Brooks more than she should have, which felt like a betrayal, even though she had done nothing wrong. In her rare quiet moments, usually late at night when Richard snored beside her and she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she replayed their brief conversation, the kindness in his voice, the certainty with which he had dismissed Richard's lies, the offer of sanctuary that seemed too good to be true. She started watching for him when she went to town, which Richard now insisted she do only once a week, and always when he could accompany her. But on a Thursday morning in early May, Richard received an urgent summons to travel to Kansas City to meet with potential investors for his latest scheme. He would be gone for 4 days, and Gabriella felt the tension drain from her shoulders the moment his train pulled out of the station. For 4 days, she could breathe. For 4 days, she was free. She spent the first day simply enjoying the silence of the house, moving through rooms without fear of criticism or violence. She aired out the curtains, swept the floors with actual pleasure rather than anxious efficiency, and made herself a meal she actually wanted to eat. The second day, she ventured into the garden that she had been neglecting because Richard complained about dirt under her fingernails. The third day, she decided to visit the library, a building she hadn't entered in over a year, because Richard said books gave her dangerous ideas. The library was a small wooden structure near the church, run by a formidable widow named Mrs. Patterson, who had little patience for nonsense. Gabriella slipped inside, breathing in the musty smell of old books, and felt something inside her chest loosen. This was what life should be: simple pleasures, small freedoms. She was browsing the poetry section when she heard the door open and close, followed by familiar footsteps. She turned to find Zachary Brooks standing near the entrance, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression of relief so profound it made her heart skip. "Mrs. Everson," he said, "I was hoping I might find you here." "Mr. Brooks?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "This is unexpected. I heard your husband left town for a few days. Wanted to check that you were all right." The fact that he was keeping track of Richard's movements should have alarmed her, but instead, it felt reassuring. Someone was paying attention. Someone cared whether she survived. "I'm well," she said. "Better, actually. These few days have been like a reprieve." Zachary moved closer, his boots quiet on the wooden floor. Up close, she could see the concern etched in the lines around his eyes. "Has he hurt you again since we met?" Gabriella glanced toward Mrs. Patterson, who was studiously organizing books at the front desk and pretending not to listen. "Mr. Brooks, I don't think this is an appropriate conversation." "Probably not," he agreed. "But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, Mrs. Everson, about your situation, about what I saw in your eyes that day." "What did you see?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Someone drowning," Zachary said simply. "Someone who has been drowning for a long time and is too tired to even call for help anymore." The accuracy of his assessment hit her like a physical blow. Tears welled up, and she turned away quickly, pressing her palm against her mouth to hold back the sob threatening to escape. She felt Zachary's presence behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to upset you, but I meant what I said before. If you need help, I'm offering it. No conditions, no expectations, just a safe place to land if you decide to jump." Gabriella wiped her eyes and turned to face him. "Why would you do that for a stranger? You don't know me. You don't know what I might have done to deserve this." "Nobody deserves to be beaten and isolated," Zachary said firmly. "And you're not a stranger anymore. You're Gabriella, and you deserve better than what that man is giving you." The sound of her name on his lips did something strange to her insides, a flutter of feelings she had thought was long dead. This was dangerous territory, dangerous in ways that could destroy what little stability she still possessed. But it was also the first real human connection she had experienced in years. "Richard will be back on Sunday," she heard herself say. "And then everything will go back to how it was." "It doesn't have to. You don't understand. He has everyone convinced I'm unstable. If I leave, he'll have me hunted down and committed. There's no escape from a marriage, not for women like me." Zachary was quiet for a long moment. "My ranch boss, Jack Morgan, his wife left her first husband back in 1870. Husband was a drunk who beat her bloody. Jack helped her get to Denver, helped her start over. When enough time had passed and it was safe, she came back and they got married. It can be done, Mrs. Everson. It takes planning and courage, but it can be done. The possibility he was describing felt like a fantasy, too distant and improbable to be real. But the seed of it took root in her mind anyway, pushing through the hard-packed soil of her despair. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move. "Richard has neighbors watching the house. Someone named Mrs. Coleman reports to him regularly. If she tells him I spent time talking to you, then let's not give her anything to report." Zachary pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. "That's a map to the Double Bar Ranch. Like I said, any time, day, or night. Will you at least consider it?" Gabriella closed her fingers around the paper, feeling its edges bite into her palm. "I'll consider it. That's all I ask." Zachary put his hat back on and tipped it to her. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Everson." He left the library, and Gabriella stood there clutching the map like a lifeline, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration. She tucked it carefully into her sleeve and selected a book at random, checking it out with Mrs. Patterson, who gave her a knowing look but said nothing. That night, alone in her bed, Gabriella unfolded the map and studied it by lamplight. The route was clearly marked, the landmarks labeled in neat handwriting. 6 miles west on the main road, then a turnoff marked by an old oak tree split by lightning. Another mile to the ranch house. It might as well have been 600 miles for all the impossible obstacles between her current location and that promise of safety. But she memorized the map anyway, burning every detail into her mind before tucking it under a loose floorboard beneath her side of the bed. Just knowing it was there helped her breathe a little easier. Richard returned on Sunday evening in a foul mood. The investors had rejected his proposal, and he was nursing both wounded pride and a hangover from drinking away his disappointment. Gabriella's brief reprieve evaporated the moment he walked through the door, demanding dinner despite the late hour and the lack of advance notice. She scrambled to put together a meal while he ranted about the short-sightedness of Kansas City businessmen and the general unfairness of the world. She was pulling a pan of cornbread from the oven when he suddenly went quiet, and she knew with sickening certainty that something was wrong. "You've been out," he said. It wasn't a question. "Only to the general store and the library," she said carefully. "Mrs. Coleman can confirm I didn't go anywhere else. Mrs. Coleman also says a cowboy has been asking about you around town, asking about me, about our marriage, about our house." Gabriella's blood ran cold. Zachary had been too visible, too obvious in his concern. She should have known this would happen. "I don't know anything about that," she said, which was technically true. She hadn't known Zachary was asking questions. Richard stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Are you having an affair, Gabriella? Is that what this is? You're spreading your legs for some worthless ranch hand?" "No! Richard, I swear I barely know the man. He helped me carry groceries once. That's all." "Then why is he so interested in our business?" Richard advanced on her, backing her against the counter. "Why is he telling people he's worried about your welfare?" "I don't know. Maybe he's just a kind person who—" The slap came so fast she didn't have time to flinch. Her head snapped to the side, and she tasted blood where her teeth cut into her cheek. Richard grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "You will stay away from that man," he hissed. "You will not speak to him, look at him, or acknowledge his existence. If I hear his name associated with yours one more time, I will make good on my threat. Do you understand me?" "Yes," Gabriella whispered. "Yes, what?" "Yes, Richard, I understand." He released her with a shove and returned to the table, picking up his fork as though nothing had happened. "Now, serve dinner, and make sure the cornbread isn't burned." Gabriella moved mechanically through the motions of serving him, her cheek throbbing, her mind racing. Zachary had made things worse with his questions, but she couldn't bring herself to be angry with him. He had been trying to help, trying to understand. It wasn't his fault that Richard's paranoia and control extended so far. That night, after Richard had drunk himself into a stupor and fallen into bed, Gabriella stood at the bedroom window and stared out at the darkness. Somewhere out there, 6 miles west, was a place where she might be safe. But getting there meant abandoning everything she knew, risking capture and institutionalization, possibly endangering Zachary and anyone else who helped her. The price of freedom seemed impossibly high. The next few weeks were a special kind of hell. Richard, convinced that Gabriella was involved with Zachary, became obsessive about her whereabouts and activities. He accompanied her everywhere, even to church on Sundays, sitting beside her with a possessive hand on her knee that looked affectionate but felt like a shackle. He told anyone who would listen that his wife's condition was worsening, that she had developed delusions and paranoid fantasies about her own husband. Gabriella felt herself becoming the ghost Richard had always claimed she was. She spoke less, ate less, barely slept. The isolation was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that help existed just beyond her reach. She hadn't seen Zachary since that day in the library, but she thought about him constantly, wondered if he had given up on her, decided she wasn't worth the trouble. Then one morning in late May, while Richard was meeting with his lawyer about some property dispute, Gabriella was in the garden trying to revive the struggling tomato plants when she heard a soft whistle from beyond the fence. She looked up to find Zachary crouched in the alley, barely visible behind the overgrown lilac bushes that separated their property from the neighbors. Her first instinct was panic. If anyone saw him there, if Mrs. Coleman happened to glance out her window at the wrong moment, Richard's threats would become reality. But Zachary's presence also sent a surge of relief through her so powerful, it almost brought her to her knees. She glanced around quickly, confirming that she was alone, then moved closer to the fence as casually as she could manage, pretending to examine the lilacs. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered urgently. "I know, but I couldn't stay away any longer. Are you all right? I heard things have gotten worse." "Richard knows you've been asking about me. He's watching me constantly now. He hit me again and threatened to have me committed if I even speak to you." Zachary's jaw clenched visibly. "That's it. You're leaving. Tonight." "I can't. He'll find me. You don't understand how connected he is, how many people believe his lies. Then we'll make sure he doesn't find you. Pack what you can carry, just essentials. At midnight tonight, go to the back gate. I'll have a horse waiting. We'll get you to the ranch, and from there, we can plan your next move. But, Gabriella, you can't stay here. He's going to kill you eventually. You know that, don't you?" She did know it, had known it for a while now, even though she hadn't let herself think the words. Richard's violence was escalating, and there would come a day when he went too far, when his fists or his rage would extinguish what little life she had left. "What about you?" she asked. "He'll come after you. He'll accuse you of kidnapping or adultery or worse." "Let him try. Jack Morgan has some influence in this county, and we've got witnesses who have seen your injuries, heard Richard's threats. You're not as alone as he's made you think." Tears spilled down Gabriella's cheeks. "I'm so scared." "I know. But fear is just the price of freedom. Midnight, Gabriella, back gate. Can you do that?" She thought about her life, about the woman she had been before Richard slowly dismantled her piece by piece. She thought about the possibility of days without fear, nights without violence, a future that held something besides slow death. "Midnight," she agreed. "I'll be there." Zachary smiled, quick and bright, and then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the alley like he had never been there at all. Gabriella returned to her tomato plants with shaking hands, her mind already cataloging what she could take, what she would have to leave behind. Not much, as it turned out. Most of her possessions were things Richard had chosen, things that didn't matter. She would take a change of clothes, her mother's locket, and the few coins she had managed to save from the household money without Richard noticing. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Richard returned home in the late afternoon, suspicious and irritable, clearly expecting to find evidence of Gabriella's imagined infidelity. When he found none, he seemed almost disappointed. They ate dinner in tense silence, and Gabriella had to force herself to swallow food that tasted like ash. By 10 o'clock, Richard was half drunk and nodding off in his chair. By 11, he had staggered to bed and was snoring loudly. Gabriella waited in the darkness of the parlor, her small bundle of belongings clutched in her lap, counting the minutes. Every creak of the house made her jump, certain that Richard would wake and discover her plan. At 11:45, she crept to the back door and slowly turned the handle. The hinges squeaked softly, and she froze, listening for any change in Richard's snoring. Nothing. She slipped outside into the cool night air, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. The back gate seemed impossibly far away, though it was only 30 yards across the yard. Every step felt exposed, visible, though the moon was barely a sliver and the shadows were thick. She had just reached the gate when she heard it, the creak of floorboards from inside the house. Richard was awake. Panic seized her. She fumbled with the gate latch, her fingers clumsy with fear, and finally got it open just as she heard Richard's voice bellowing her name from inside the house. She ran then, abandoning caution, and found Zachary waiting in the alley with 2 horses, exactly as promised. "He's awake," she gasped. "He knows I'm gone." "Then we ride fast." Zachary practically lifted her into the saddle, then swung onto his own horse. "Hold on tight and follow my lead." They took off at a gallop just as the back door banged open and Richard stumbled into the yard, shouting obscenities and threats into the night. Gabriella pressed herself low against the horse's neck, her heart hammering, every muscle tensed for the sound of gunfire. But no shots came, and soon they had left the house and its horrors behind, racing west through the darkness towards Sanctuary. The 6-mile ride felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. Gabriella had never been a confident rider, but fear and adrenaline kept her in the saddle as they thundered across the prairie. Zachary glanced back frequently to check on her, adjusting their pace when he saw her struggling, but they didn't stop or slow until the buildings of the Double Bar Ranch appeared in the distance, solid and welcoming against the star-filled sky. They clattered into the ranch yard, and immediately people appeared from the bunkhouse and main house, summoned by the sound of urgent hoofbeats. A tall man with graying hair approached, pulling suspenders up over his nightshirt, his face creased with concern. "Zachary, what's going on?" "Jack, this is Gabriella Everson. She needs help. Her husband has been beating her and threatening to have her committed. He knows she's gone and he'll come looking." Jack Morgan studied Gabriella for a long moment, taking in her disheveled appearance, the fresh bruise blooming on her cheek, the terror still written in her eyes. Then he nodded decisively. "Sarah," he called toward the house, "we've got a guest who needs a room and some care." A woman appeared in the doorway, her long braid falling over one shoulder, her face kind and alert despite the late hour. This must be the wife Zachary had mentioned, the one who had escaped her own nightmare marriage. She took one look at Gabriella and understood everything that needed understanding. "Come inside, dear," Sarah said, approaching with her arms already extended. "You're safe now. He can't touch you here." Gabriella practically fell off the horse into Sarah's embrace, and the dam of emotion she had been holding back for years finally broke. She sobbed into this stranger's shoulder, while Sarah murmured soothing words and stroked her hair, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Gabriella felt like someone truly saw her suffering and cared. Zachary watched with an expression of mingled relief and rage, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Jack put a hand on his shoulder and said something too quiet for Gabriella to hear, and Zachary nodded, some of the tension leaving his posture. Sarah eventually guided Gabriella into the ranch house, which was warm and comfortable and smelled like wood smoke and coffee. She was led to a small guest room with a real bed, clean sheets, and a window that looked out over the prairie. Sarah brought water for washing, and a nightgown that was too big but wonderfully soft. "Get some rest," Sarah said gently. "Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out the details. For tonight, just know that you're safe. We won't let him take you." After Sarah left, Gabriella sank onto the bed, exhausted beyond measure, but too wired to sleep. She kept expecting Richard to burst through the door, kept hearing his voice in every distant sound. But gradually, as the night deepened and nothing terrible happened, she began to believe that maybe, possibly, she had actually escaped. She must have dozed off eventually, because she woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of voices drifting up from downstairs. For a disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and panic fluttered in her chest. Then, memory returned, and with it, a cautious hope. She washed and dressed in her own clothes, which someone had thoughtfully cleaned and pressed overnight, then made her way downstairs. The main room of the ranch house was large and open, with a long table surrounded by chairs and a kitchen area where Sarah was cooking breakfast. Jack sat at the table with Zachary and 2 other ranch hands, all of them deep in discussion. They looked up when she entered, and Zachary immediately stood, pulling out a chair for her. "Morning," he said, and the warmth in his voice made her cheeks flush. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted. "Thank you all for taking me in. I know this puts you in a difficult position." "The only difficult position is the one your husband put you in," Jack said firmly. "We're happy to help. Now, we need to talk about next steps, because Richard Everson came by here at dawn, making threats and accusations." Gabriella's blood ran cold. "What did he say?" "Claimed you were kidnapped, that Zachary had seduced and abducted you, that you weren't in your right mind to make decisions. He threatened to bring the sheriff and have Zachary arrested. He'll do it, Gabriella said urgently. He knows the sheriff. They play cards together. Sheriff Morton will believe whatever Richard tells him. Maybe, Jack allowed. But Morton also knows me, and I've got some credibility in this county too. More importantly, you're here of your own free will, and you're an adult with the right to leave an abusive marriage. That's not how the law sees it, Gabriella said bitterly. I'm his property. He can do whatever he wants to me, and the law will support him. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table, because they all knew she was right. In 1876, a woman's legal rights were minimal at best. Divorce was scandalous and difficult to obtain. A man who beat his wife might be frowned upon, but he rarely faced serious consequences. Then we need to be smart about this, Zachary said. Gabriella, would you be willing to talk to a lawyer? Maybe Judge Harrison in Salina? He's got a reputation for fairness, and he doesn't much like bullies. Richard will never agree to a divorce. He might not have a choice if we can document the abuse, get witness statements, build a case. It'll take time, but it's possible. Gabriella looked around the table at these people who barely knew her but were willing to fight for her anyway. Something fierce and bright kindled in her chest, something she eventually recognized as her own will to survive. All right, she said, tell me what I need to do. The next few weeks fell into an unexpected rhythm. Gabriella stayed in the guest room at the ranch house, helping Sarah with cooking and household tasks, slowly relearning how to move through the world without fear. Richard made 2 more visits to the ranch, each time more aggressive than the last, but Jack and the ranch hands stood firm, refusing him entry and insisting that Gabriella was there voluntarily. Sheriff Morton did eventually come, looking uncomfortable and apologetic, but he had to verify that no crime had been committed. Gabriella spoke to him privately, showed him her fading bruises, and told him in clear, steady terms that she had left her husband because he beat her, and she feared for her life. Morton had known Gabriella's father, had respected him, and seeing the evidence of Richard's cruelty seemed to shake his certainty. I can't force you to go back, he said finally. But Mrs. Everson, this is going to get ugly. Your husband is talking about having you evaluated by a doctor, possibly committed. He's within his rights to do that. Let him try, Jack interjected from where he stood in the doorway. Any doctor who examines Gabriella will see she's perfectly sane. What they'll also see is evidence of repeated physical abuse. Morton sighed. I'm not saying I agree with Everson's methods. I'm just telling you how this is likely to play out. He's got money and connections. He'll make this a fight. Then we'll fight, Zachary said, appearing beside Jack. She's not going back to that house. Morton left, without forcing the issue, and Gabriella felt a small victory in that. But she knew Richard wouldn't give up. He had too much pride, too much invested in maintaining his image of the long-suffering husband dealing with a difficult wife. True to form, Richard escalated. He began spreading even more vicious rumors about Gabriella's mental state and moral character. He claimed she had been carrying on multiple affairs, that she had stolen money from him, that she had threatened his life. The fact that none of it was true didn't seem to matter. Some people believed him simply because he said it loudly and often enough. But others, particularly women, who had perhaps experienced their own struggles with difficult husbands, began to speak up. Mrs. Patterson from the library wrote a letter to the newspaper editor, praising Gabriella's character and questioning Richard's version of events. A neighbor who had heard Gabriella's screams through the walls admitted she had always suspected abuse. Slowly, carefully, cracks began to appear in Richard's carefully constructed facade. Through it all, Zachary was a constant presence. He worked his regular shifts at the ranch, but spent every spare moment with Gabriella, talking with her, listening to her story, helping her remember who she had been before Richard had tried to erase her. They took long walks across the prairie in the evenings, carefully chaperoned by Sarah, or one of the other ranch hands to protect Gabriella's reputation. And during those walks, Gabriella felt herself slowly coming back to life. Tell me about your family, Zachary said one evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. There's not much to tell anymore, Gabriella said. My parents died of fever when I was 20. I had no siblings, no close relatives. Richard seemed like salvation at the time. He was charming and attentive, and I was grieving and alone. I didn't see the warning signs until it was too late. That's not your fault. Men like him are good at hiding who they really are until they've got you trapped. When did you become such an expert on abusive men? She asked, not unkindly. Zachary was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. My oldest sister, Caroline, married a man like Richard. By the time we realized what was happening, she was too afraid to leave. We tried to help her, my whole family, but she kept defending him, kept making excuses. Then one night he beat her so badly she lost the baby she was carrying. That was finally enough. My brothers and I went and got her, brought her home. The bastard came after her, and my father met him at the door with a shotgun and a promise to use it if he ever saw him again. What happened to Caroline? She healed. It took time, a lot of time, but she healed. She's married again now, to a good man who treats her the way she deserves. She's happy. And when I saw you that day outside the general store, I saw her in your eyes, that same trapped, desperate look. I couldn't walk away from that. Gabriella stopped walking and turned to face him. You saved me, Zachary. I would have died in that house. Slowly or quickly, but I would have died. You gave me my life back. You saved yourself, he corrected gently. I just provided the horse. She laughed, a real laugh, and was startled by the sound of it. When had she last laughed? She couldn't even remember. They stood there in the fading light, and Gabriella became acutely aware of how close Zachary was standing, how easy it would be to close the distance between them. She saw the same awareness in his eyes, the careful restraint of a man who wanted something, but knew the timing wasn't right. We should head back, she said softly. Sarah will have dinner ready. Right, of course. But Zachary didn't move immediately, and neither did she. Finally, with visible effort, he stepped back and offered his arm. Shall we? She took it, and they walked back to the ranch house in comfortable silence, something warm and promising building in the air between them. A month after Gabriella's escape, they made the journey to Salina to meet with Judge Harrison. Jack and Sarah accompanied them, along with the written testimonies they had collected from people willing to speak to Gabriella's character and the evidence of Richard's abuse. The judge was an elderly man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for cutting through nonsense. He listened to their presentation, examined the photographs that a local photographer had taken of Gabriella's bruises before they faded completely, and read the witness statements. Then he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Mrs. Everson, what you're asking for is not easy. Divorce is frowned upon, and the law is not generally sympathetic to wives who leave their husbands, regardless of the circumstances. However, I have some discretion in cases of proven cruelty and abandonment. Based on what I've seen here, I'm willing to grant you a legal separation, with the possibility of divorce proceedings, if your husband contests. Relief washed over Gabriella so powerfully she felt lightheaded. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet. Mr. Everson will fight this, and he'll fight dirty. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to stand in court and detail every incident of abuse, knowing that people will judge you for it? Gabriella thought about the yellow house on Maple Street, about the woman she had been there, small and silent and slowly dying. Then she thought about the woman she was becoming here at the ranch, stronger each day, learning to laugh again, feeling hope stir in her chest. Yes, she said firmly. I'm prepared. Judge Harrison nodded. Then we'll proceed. I'll have the papers drawn up and served to Mr. Everson. In the meantime, I suggest you stay where you are. The ranch provides both protection and witnesses to your good character. The papers were served 3 days later, and Richard's response was explosive. He showed up at the ranch with 2 hired men, demanding that Gabriella be turned over to him immediately. When Jack refused, Richard tried to force his way onto the property, and only the presence of multiple armed ranch hands convinced him to leave. But he didn't give up. He filed counterclaims with the court, painting Gabriella as a delusional adulteress who had abandoned her marital duties. He demanded she be examined by a doctor of his choosing, preferably one who specialized in female hysteria and nervous disorders. He threatened to bankrupt anyone who continued to shelter his wayward wife. The legal battle consumed the rest of the summer and stretched into fall. Gabriella had to travel to Salina twice more to give depositions, reliving the worst moments of her marriage in clinical detail. It was excruciating and humiliating, but also strangely empowering. For the first time, someone in authority was actually listening to her story and taking it seriously. Through it all, Zachary remained steadfast. He accompanied her to Selena, sitting in the courthouse hallway during her depositions so that she knew he was nearby. He helped her practice her testimony so she wouldn't falter under hostile questioning. He reminded her, again and again, that she was strong enough to endure this. Somewhere along the way, gratitude transformed into something deeper. Gabriella found herself watching for Zachary when he was out on the range, feeling her heart lift when she heard his voice. She noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands when he helped her mount a horse, the careful respect with which he always treated her. And she saw in his face that he felt the same pull, the same growing attachment, though he never acted on it. One evening in late September, after a particularly difficult day of legal wrangling, Gabriella found Zachary sitting on the porch watching the stars emerge. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I could never have done this without you. You're stronger than you think, Gabriella. Maybe now, but I wasn't before you showed up." She took a breath, gathering her courage. "Zachary, I need you to know something. These feelings I have for you, they're real. And I know the timing is terrible. I'm still married, still fighting to be free, and you've been nothing but honorable and patient. But I need you to know that when this is over, when I'm finally free, I want to explore what's been growing between us, if you want that too." Zachary turned to look at her, his blue eyes intense in the dim light. "I've wanted that since the day I met you. But I also want you to be sure. You've been through hell, and sometimes gratitude can look a lot like love." "This isn't gratitude," Gabriella said firmly. "Or maybe it started that way, but it's become so much more. You make me feel alive, Zachary. You make me want to build a future instead of just surviving the present. That's not gratitude. That's something real." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Zachary reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, warm and gentle. "Then, when you're free," he said softly, "truly free, we'll see where this goes, but not before. I won't have anyone saying I took advantage of you or that your feelings aren't real because you were vulnerable. It was the right thing to say, the honorable thing, and Gabriella loved him for it, even as she wished they could fast forward through the waiting. The final court hearing took place in early November. Judge Harrison had reviewed all the evidence, heard testimony from both sides, and was ready to issue his ruling. The courtroom was packed with curious townspeople, some supportive of Gabriella, others clearly on Richard's side. Gabriella sat at the plaintiff's table with the lawyer Jack had helped her hire, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Richard sat across the aisle with his lawyer, radiating barely controlled fury. He had lost weight and gained lines around his eyes. The pretense of the charming, concerned husband had been stripped away, leaving only the angry, entitled man beneath. Judge Harrison entered, and everyone rose. When he told them to be seated, the rustling of fabric seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. "I have reviewed this case extensively," the judge began, "and rarely have I seen such a clear pattern of abuse and manipulation. Mr. Everson, you have attempted to paint your wife as unstable and unfaithful, but the evidence tells a very different story. Multiple witnesses have testified to your violence, to your wife's injuries, to your controlling behavior. Medical examination has confirmed that Mrs. Everson is in full possession of her faculties and shows no signs of the hysteria or delusion you have claimed." Richard started to speak, but his lawyer grabbed his arm, shaking his head urgently. "Furthermore," Judge Harrison continued, "your efforts to isolate your wife and destroy her reputation speak to a pattern of abuse that this court cannot ignore. Therefore, I am granting Mrs. Everson a divorce on the grounds of cruelty. The marriage is dissolved, effective immediately. Mrs. Everson is free to resume her maiden name if she chooses and to live her life as she sees fit. Mr. Everson, you are prohibited from contacting or approaching your former wife. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Do I make myself clear?" "This is outrageous!" Richard shouted, leaping to his feet. "That woman is my wife. You can't just—" "I can and I have," Judge Harrison said coldly. "And Mr. Everson, I would suggest you sit down and be quiet before I find you in contempt of court." Richard's lawyer physically pushed him back into his seat, whispering urgently in his ear. Gabriella felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy and relief. She was free, legally, officially, completely free. Outside the courthouse, Zachary was waiting. He had been barred from attending the hearing to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but the moment Gabriella emerged, he knew from her expression what had happened. He swept her up into his arms, spinning her around, while she laughed and cried simultaneously. "It's over," she said when he finally set her down. "He can't touch me anymore. I'm free." "You're free," Zachary echoed, and the joy in his voice matched her own. Jack and Sarah emerged from the courthouse behind her, both beaming. Sarah pulled Gabriella into a tight hug, while Jack shook Zachary's hand, congratulating him on his patience and restraint. They celebrated with dinner at Concordia's finest restaurant, and for the first time in 3 years, Gabriella ate a meal without fear, without watching the door, without calculating the quickest exit. She was simply a woman having dinner with friends, her laughter genuine, her smiles unforced. As they walked back to where the horses were tied, Zachary caught her hand, threading his fingers through hers. It was the first overtly romantic gesture he had allowed himself, and the simple contact sent warmth flooding through Gabriella's entire body. "So," he said, his voice low and intimate, "we agreed we'd see where this goes once you were free. Are you still interested in that exploration?" "More than anything," Gabriella said. "But I should probably warn you, I have no idea how to do this. Courtship, romance, any of it. Richard was my only relationship, and that was less courtship and more trap. Then we'll figure it out together. No rush, no expectations. Just 2 people getting to know each other without fear or pretense." "That sounds perfect." And it was perfect, or as close to perfect as real life allowed. Gabriella continued staying at the ranch through the winter, though Sarah discreetly rearranged the sleeping arrangements so that it was clear Gabriella had her own space and that nothing improper was occurring. Zachary courted her properly, with flowers picked from the winter-hardy plants, with long conversations by the fireplace, with small gifts he carved from wood during slow evenings. He was patient with her fears and careful with her boundaries. When she flinched at sudden movements, he slowed down and gave her space. When nightmares woke her in the dark hours before dawn, he sat with her in the kitchen, making coffee and talking about nothing important until the terror receded. He taught her to ride properly, to shoot, to handle a rope. He showed her that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. And gradually, as winter thawed into spring, Gabriella found herself healing in ways that went deeper than just escaping physical violence. She was reclaiming her own identity, discovering interests and opinions and preferences she had suppressed for so long she had forgotten they existed. She liked reading poetry, but hated needlework. She had a gift for training horses and a surprising talent for card games. She could sing, though she was shy about it, and she had strong opinions about politics that she was no longer afraid to voice. Zachary loved every discovery, every facet of her personality that emerged from behind the walls she had built for protection. He told her she was beautiful when she wore her hair loose, that he loved her laugh, that her strength amazed him, and eventually, inevitably, those careful boundaries began to shift. It happened on a warm evening in April, almost exactly a year after their first meeting. They had ridden out to a hilltop overlooking the ranch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Gabriella was wearing a new dress Sarah had helped her make, and she felt pretty and confident in ways she had never experienced before. "I love you," Zachary said suddenly, the words simple and direct. "I know we haven't been courting that long in official terms, but I've loved you for months now. Maybe from that very first day when you looked at me like I was offering you the moon by carrying your groceries." Gabriella turned to face him fully, her heart swelling with emotion. "I love you too. I've loved you since you saw through Richard's lies without even knowing me, since you offered me sanctuary without asking for anything in return, since you showed me what kindness looks like." Zachary cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and sure. "Can I kiss you?" "Please," she whispered. The kiss was soft and sweet and full of promise. It tasted like hope and new beginnings, like all the good things Gabriella had stopped believing existed. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. "Marry me," Zachary said. "Not right away, not until you're ready, but someday, when you can think about marriage without fear. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't have to hurt." "Yes," Gabriella said without hesitation. "Someday, when I'm ready, I will absolutely marry you." That someday came sooner than she expected, By July, Gabriella felt strong enough, healed enough, to think about marriage not as a trap, but as a partnership. Zachary had been saving money and had put a down payment on a small property adjacent to the Double Bar Ranch, planning to start his own cattle operation. He wanted Gabriella to help him design the house they would build there, wanted her input on everything from the placement of windows to the color of the curtains. They were married in August 1877 in a simple ceremony at Concordia's church, with Jack and Sarah as witnesses and half the town in attendance. Gabriella wore a dress of pale blue silk, and Zachary looked impossibly handsome in his best suit. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady and sure, and when he kissed her to seal their vows, Gabriella felt the last shadows of her past finally release their hold. The reception was held at the Double Bar Ranch, with music and dancing and more food than any gathering strictly needed. Gabriella danced with her new husband, with Jack, with several of the ranch hands who had protected her during those difficult months. She laughed until her sides hurt and felt joy so pure and uncomplicated it almost didn't seem real. But it was real, all of it. The house they built together, with its wide windows and bright rooms designed to welcome light and air. The cattle operation that grew slowly but steadily under their combined efforts. The quiet evenings on their porch, watching sunsets and planning their future. The physical intimacy they discovered together, Zachary always gentle and patient, as Gabriella learned that touch could bring pleasure instead of pain. Richard Everson left Concordia shortly after the divorce, unable to withstand the damage to his reputation. Rumors suggested he had gone to California, but Gabriella didn't care enough to verify. He was part of her past, a chapter closed and sealed, no longer capable of hurting her. In the spring of 1878, Gabriella discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions because carrying a child meant vulnerability, meant depending on someone else, meant risks she had trained herself to fear. But Zachary's joy was so genuine, his excitement so infectious, that her fears gradually gave way to anticipation. Their son was born in November, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Daniel, and Zachary held him with such tenderness and wonder that Gabriella fell in love with her husband all over again. She watched him with their son and saw everything Richard had never been, everything she had once thought impossible. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Emily, who arrived wailing and indignant and full of fierce personality from her very first breath. Their little house rang with laughter and sometimes crying, with the organized chaos of family life, with love so abundant it seemed to overflow the walls. Gabriella sometimes thought about the woman she had been in that yellow house on Maple Street, isolated and afraid, convinced she would die there. That woman felt like someone from another lifetime, a ghost of a person she had once been, but could barely recognize anymore. She had survived, escaped, healed, and built a life more beautiful than she had ever imagined possible. One evening when Daniel was 5 and Emily was 3, as they all sat around the dinner table Zachary had built with his own hands, Gabriella looked at her family and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Zachary noticed immediately, reaching across to squeeze her hand. "You all right?" he asked softly. "More than all right," she said. "I was just thinking about how different things could have been. How close I came to never having this." "But you do have it," Zachary said, "and you earned every bit of it with your courage and strength." That night, after the children were asleep and they lay together in their bed, Gabriella told Zachary the full truth of her thoughts. "I never believed I would be happy," she admitted. "For so long, I thought happiness was something that happened to other people, that I had somehow failed at life and deserved what I got. You showed me that wasn't true. You showed me I deserved love and respect and kindness. You saved me, Zachary, not just from Richard, but from the person I was becoming under his control." Zachary pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "You saved yourself, love. I just helped clear the path. And now, look at us. We've got a good life, good kids, and a lot of years ahead to keep building. That's not my doing. That's yours." "It's ours," Gabriella corrected. "Everything good in my life came from taking your hand that night at the back gate, from trusting you when trust felt impossible, from choosing to believe that I deserved better. You deserve everything good in this world," Zachary murmured against her hair, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." Years continued to pass, measured in birthdays and harvests, in the slow growth of their cattle operation and the faster growth of their children. Daniel grew tall and serious, with his father's work ethic and his mother's compassion. Emily was wild and joyful, afraid of nothing, secure in the knowledge that she was loved unconditionally. In 1883, they had another son, Thomas, who arrived during a spring thunderstorm and seemed to embody the drama of his entrance with his theatrical personality. Gabriella threw herself into community life in ways she never could have during her marriage to Richard. She helped organize church socials, taught Sunday school, advocated for women's education, and quietly helped other women she suspected might be trapped in situations similar to what she had endured. She became known not as the unstable woman Richard had described, but as someone strong and kind, someone who had survived terrible circumstances and used that experience to help others. Sarah Morgan became her closest friend, the sister she had never had. They shared the bond of women who understood what it meant to escape, to rebuild, to refuse to be defined by the worst things that had happened to them. Together, they created a network of support for vulnerable women, offering sanctuary at the ranch when needed, connecting people with sympathetic lawyers and doctors, spreading the word that abuse was never acceptable, never deserved. Jack Morgan eventually made Zachary a full partner in the Double Bar Ranch, recognizing his skill and dedication. The two families became so intertwined, it was sometimes hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Their children grew up together, more like cousins than friends, and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Zachary proved to be everything Richard had not been. He was steady and reliable, affectionate and communicative. He never raised his hand to Gabriella or the children, resolving conflicts with conversation and patience rather than violence and intimidation. He encouraged Gabriella's independence, celebrated her successes, supported her ambitions. He was, in every way that mattered, her true partner. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1887, Zachary surprised Gabriella with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation without the children. Sarah and Jack happily took Daniel, Emily, and Thomas for the week, and Zachary and Gabriella boarded the train heading west. Denver in August was bustling and exciting, full of theaters and restaurants and sights Gabriella had never experienced. They stayed in a real hotel with gas lighting and running water, luxuries that still felt extraordinary to people who had built their life from scratch on the prairie. They held hands walking through the streets, ate meals they didn't have to cook, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. On their last night, as they stood on their hotel balcony watching the sunset over the mountains, Zachary wrapped his arms around Gabriella from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Happy?" he asked. "Incredibly," she answered, "though I miss the children." "Me too, but it's nice to have you to myself for a bit. To remember that before we were parents, we were two people who fell in love." Gabriella turned in his arms to face him. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you for not giving up on me, for seeing through Richard's lies when everyone else believed them, for offering me a way out when I couldn't see one myself. Gabriella, you've thanked me 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. In the life we've built, the family we've created, the happiness we share. You don't owe me gratitude. You owe yourself credit for having the courage to take that chance. Then I'll thank myself for being brave enough to trust you," she said, smiling. "And I'll thank you for being worthy of that trust." They kissed as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and Gabriella thought about how far she had come from that terrified woman in the yellow house. She had survived, she had escaped, she had healed, and most importantly, she had built a life filled with love and purpose and joy. The nightmares still came occasionally, echoes of those dark years that would probably never fully disappear. But when she woke gasping in the night, Zachary was there, solid and real and safe. He held her until the fear passed, reminded her that Richard was gone and could never hurt her again, that she was strong and loved and free. And in the morning, there would be children to feed and cattle to tend, a community to serve and a husband to love. There would be ordinary days full of ordinary tasks, and Gabriella had learned that ordinary was actually extraordinary when you had lived through hell. Ordinary meant peace. Ordinary meant safety. Ordinary meant a life worth living. Years continued their steady march. Daniel went to college in Topeka, the first in either family to pursue higher education, and came back with a law degree and a passion for justice. Emily fell in love with a neighboring rancher's son and married in a ceremony even more joyful than her parents had been. Thomas discovered a talent for horse training and began building a reputation that brought buyers from as far away as Colorado. Gabriella and Zachary grew older together, their hair graying, their faces lined with the evidence of years well lived. They added rooms onto their house to accommodate visiting grandchildren, and those rooms were often full. Their property prospered, not making them wealthy, but providing a comfortable life and the ability to help others when needed. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and they sat together on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done hundreds of times before, Gabriella would think about the randomness of their meeting. If she hadn't gone to the general store that particular day, if Zachary hadn't been in town that particular moment, if she hadn't bumped into him, if he hadn't been the kind of man who saw past surfaces to truth, if he hadn't been brave enough to offer help to a stranger. But those things had happened, and from that chance collision outside a general store, an entire life had bloomed. A good life, a happy life, a life worth fighting for. In the spring of 1902, Gabriella and Zachary celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, Jack and Sarah, and their extended family, and half of Concordia's population. At 60 years old, Gabriella still carried herself with the grace and strength that had defined her rebuilding. The scared, broken woman Richard had tried to create was completely gone, replaced by someone confident and capable and deeply content. As the party wound down and people began heading home, Zachary found Gabriella standing alone near the garden she had cultivated over the years, looking out over the land they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his hand into hers. "I'm thinking about walls," she said. "The walls Richard built around me with his lies, trying to isolate me from the world. How thick and high those walls became, until I couldn't see any way out. And then, I'm thinking about you, and how you broke through those walls not with force or violence, but with kindness and patience and the simple act of seeing me as a person worth saving. You were always worth saving, Gabriella. Always." She squeezed his hand, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I know that now. It took a long time, and a lot of healing, but I finally believe it. And I believe that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is accept help when it's offered, to trust, even when trust has been shattered, to hope, even when hope seems foolish." "I'm glad you trusted me," Zachary said softly. "I'm glad you took that chance." "Best decision I ever made," Gabriella said. "Well, that and marrying you. Those might be the same decision. They might be at that." They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the evidence of their shared life, and Gabriella felt a completeness she would never have thought possible in those dark years with Richard. She had been isolated, broken, trapped by cruel lies and deliberate cruelty. But she had also been saved, not by some fairy tale prince, but by a good man who offered her a chance and by her own courage in taking it. The story could have ended so differently. So many women's stories did end differently, in violence or insanity or quiet despair. But Gabriella had escaped, and she had healed, and she had built something beautiful from the ashes of her trauma. And in doing so, she had proven that even the highest walls could be broken through, that even the cruelest lies could be exposed, that even the most isolated and frightened person could find their way to freedom. As twilight deepened into night and stars began to appear in the endless Kansas sky, Gabriella and Zachary walked hand in hand back to their house, where their family waited with laughter and love and all the simple, precious things that made life worth living. Behind them, the past was finally, truly finished. Ahead of them, whatever years remained would be lived in the light, together, free from fear. And that, Gabriella thought, as Zachary opened the door and gestured her inside with his characteristic gentle courtesy, was the happiest ending she could have ever imagined.